Important and interesting topic. My name is Kate Tarrant and I work for the Lower Blackwood Landcare Group. For those of you that don't know us, we're a not-for-profit independent landcare organisation with an interest in sustainable agriculture and the broader environment and river health in the Lower Blackwood catchment. You can find out more about us and the work we do on our website, lowerblackwood.com.au. Before we kick off, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we all live and work. I acknowledge the Wadandi Bibbulmun people of the Bibbulmun Nation and pay our respects to elders past, present and future. Just a few words about how the webinar will run today. You may have noticed by now that you can hear us but not speak yourselves. That is deliberate so we can keep things moving along at a good pace. You can definitely still ask questions though, so please don't be shy. Just type your question at any time into the chat box and I'll make sure it gets asked either during or at the end of the presentation. Also, if you run into any technical difficulties, please use the status button, which is the hand on the bottom right-hand side of your screen to let me know, and I'll see if I can fix it at our end. Don't worry though, if you have to leave early or drop out, as we will be recording the session, which I'll email out to you all next week. Okay, to the reason we have all tuned in today, I'd like to welcome David Hardwick, agroecologist and partner in Soil Land Food, a rural change management company specialising in capacity building, training, consulting and extensions for farmers, grazers and rural communities. With more than 20 years experience in rural landscapes, farming and food systems, David is passionate about supporting change in Australian rural landscapes, farming and food systems towards a more regenerative and ecological future. So today, David is going to work through with us how to see our landscape using landscape thinking and the science and practice behind landscape regeneration and rehydration. So welcome to you, David, and I'll let you take over.
Thanks very much, Kate, and yeah, thanks for everyone for coming along. I hope that you get something from tonight's webinar. I'm just going to share my screen, so bear with me a minute while we kick off. So hopefully everyone can see that first slide there to kick us off for this evening. Yep, and as Kate mentioned, I'm an agroecologist here at Soil Land Food. We're based at Albury in southern New South Wales on the Murray River on the border with Victoria, and we work all over Australia, myself and the Soil Land Food team. So yeah, welcome to this really exciting and topic that is growing interest with landholders around Australia, and that is how do we reboot our farm landscape. So tonight what I guess I was going to do is try to give a broad overview of the essentials and the key process to follow, I guess, to try and get success if we are going to regenerate rural landscapes for the 21st century challenge of feeding the world. So I'll kick right off into it. So the great challenge, I guess, that we have in the 21st century is balancing the environment and agriculture. And the reason that I think that's a great challenge is that I think in the 20th century, we probably worked out how to grow enough food to feed everyone on the planet. I think there's a fairly strong agreement around the world with people in the game of food systems and food production that we can actually grow enough food for even more people than we have on the planet at the moment. The problem is often an issue of distribution and waste, but we still have a challenge to grow enough food to feed everyone and humans keep reproducing. But the challenge for the 21st century is, okay, we've worked out how to grow lots of food. Now can we grow a lot of food and still look after the natural capital or the natural assets or the environment which we depend on to do that agriculture? And not only that, but to look after everything else, or the biodiversity that lives on the planet with us. So I guess this is our great challenge. And here's a couple of graziers in northern Queensland in the Kennedy Valley who are at the coal front of that, like most of you guys will be if you're in a landholder. And these guys are trying to balance grazing landscapes with mahogany glider habitat in that valley, which is in the wet tropics of Queensland. And you can see them there really just trying to nut out some planning around achieving that goal. I guess another way to think about it is that we really need to look after our natural capital. That's another buzzword around at the moment. And one of the reasons for that is that it's good for your farm business. So your natural capital, which is your soils, your water, your vegetation, etc., basically is an asset in your business, if you like, and it underpins primary production. So if we look after that natural capital, it improves our enterprise performance, so the efficiency of how much meat we grow per millimetre of rain, for example. It can help us reduce our enterprise costs. It can help build a bit of resilience through difficult seasons, as well as basically making us feel more satisfied and content because we have this innate deep connection to the landscape that we live in. But the second reason that looking after natural capital is important, it's not only for agriculture, is it's good for country, or it's good for the nation, whichever way you want to put it. Obviously, if we use that First Peoples term of country, you know, it's good for the country in general that we all rely on and live in. And the reason is that it can help restore and conserve biodiversity, increase resilience at a regional level, or what we call a bioregional level, but also increase community health. So all of those things are really important, and they are all linked to a healthier environment. This is a tree in northern New South Wales, in a town called Bingara on the Guida River, and you can just see that change in surface depth as the river has changed through erosion since European settlement, most likely has changed, the level of the landscape, literally through a change in the water cycle, basically upstream from that point. So we need to look after things. So I guess the specifics are, what are we actually trying to achieve specifically as we go through this process of trying to reboot landscapes? Well, I guess if we think about it as a landholder or someone that's farming and grazing and owns and manages land, we're really trying to achieve a couple of things. And the first two are healthy landscapes, so that they function really well, so they capture their water, they grow the maximum vegetation, they maintain biodiversity. So we want to have a healthy landscape, which is basically your natural capital in good condition, if we think of it from another term. And the second thing is build a resilient landscape, so one that can bounce back to a functioning position after it goes through extreme stress, such as droughts or bushfires or severe flooding, etc. So after your landscape goes through a major event, it can bounce, it can return to a highly functioning system quite quickly. It may not be exactly the same as it was before, but it can be functioning and resilient again and productive again after that event. I guess this third and fourth key reason that we're trying to fix the problems here is that these are agricultural landscapes. Farming landscapes are agricultural landscapes, and we need them to be efficient. So they need to be efficient in a whole lot of ways, not just for natural ecosystem processes, but actually also for the enterprise. So are you getting around your property as efficiently as you can? Are you able to move animals around as efficiently as you can? So a well-designed rural landscape is really efficient on a whole lot of levels, and that can literally mean saving you weeks of work a year. And then, of course, also because we're in the game of agriculture, they need to be productive, which then influences the profit. So obviously profit is also about farm gate price for what you grow, but we can try to move towards that profitable position. So I guess there's four key sort of targets that we're aiming for often when we're managing rural landscapes. And I think the thing to really remember here at this point is, this is, I guess, the 21st century understanding of farming, is that you need a landscape to grow both agricultural products like wool and wheat, like these guys here near Forbes in New South Wales. You actually need a whole landscape to grow agricultural products, but also you need a landscape to grow environmental products. So that's things like carbon, soil carbon, biodiversity credits. You need a landscape to do both agricultural products and environmental products. And that, of course, means that farmers and graziers are kind of in the box seat when it comes to environmental products because they own landscapes. But also it means taking a bit of a different view when we're doing agricultural production. It's not just about chucking stuff in and then driving production and getting stuff off. We've got to realise that those crops and pastures and animals and plants are all actually interacting with a landscape. So we need to think a little bit more holistically and broadly when we're making management decisions. So I guess the question is at this point, what are farm landscapes? Here's a Western Victorian landscape on volcanic country, and you can see fences and paddocks under different stages and different management, a few trees here and there. So I guess what is a farm landscape? So basically in Soil and Food, we have a kind of 4-part model to your landscape, if you like. And the first one is its geography. So here's a bit of geography in the southwest slopes of New South Wales near Gundagai, if anyone knows that area. And geography is kind of like those parts of your landscape that influence everything you do, but you can't do a lot to change them. So obviously climate, it influences every decision you make, and it influences the landscape as well as your farm enterprise. You can't do a lot to change it, although probably at a global scale we're doing something, but you have to adapt to its limitations. And terrain or topography is the second element. And then the soil types. So those aspects of your soil that don't change much, you just have to live with them. So I have sandy soil or heavy clay soil or a loamy soil. Those aspects of your soil, which we call the soil's type, which is texture, overall fertility and colloid size, they don't change greatly under management. You have to adapt what you do to the soil types. And the final one for farm landscapes is, of course, you have neighbours who you often can't influence, although sometimes you can. And so we stick them into the geography because you often have to manage their influence on your place to a greater or lesser extent. The second key part of your rural landscape, of a farm landscape, is what we call the landscape elements. So here's the Atherton Tablelands in northern Queensland, and you can see it looks quite what we call patchy. So it's very typical of a rural landscape. Some have more trees than others. Some are more hilly than others. But rural landscapes have patches. Natural landscapes have patches, and that's a scientific term, believe it or not, from landscape ecology. So you can see here there's different patches. There's small clumps of trees. There's larger sort of patches of trees. There's tree rows. There's fences, which are breaking things into paddocks. There's also dams, creeks, riparian areas, etc. And these are all different parts of your landscape, what we call their landscape elements. And the key thing about a landscape patch, whether it be a wet area at the bottom of your paddock or a rocky outcrop on top of a hill or a tree line along the side of a paddock, they might all be in the one fenced area or in the one paddock, but they're all different patches. And that's because they all play a different ecological function in your landscape. For example, the animals will interact with all those three things differently. But secondly, they all have unique management challenges. So the tree line, the wet area, and the rocky outcrop, you probably have different kind of management challenges, even though they're all in the same paddock, especially depending on what your outcome goals are for those different patches. If you want to keep the tree line healthy or maybe even add to it, you might want to keep the animals out of the wet patch without a fence, or keep them away from there in certain times of the year, etc. So your landscape, your property, is full of what we call landscape patches. It's also full of what we call hydrological units, and they're the other kind of parts to the puzzle when it comes to rural landscapes. So here's Peter Hazel from the Malone Institute with a group Malamalankare group training session, and you can see he's standing in what used to be a drainage line, which is now a gully. And so that's what you might call one of the water elements, or water patches is another way of thinking of your hydrological unit. So in this case, it's a drainage line, or a gully now, or a streamline, or a creek, or a dam, or a floodplain, or a spring. These are all the watery patches, if you like, on a property. And so we treat them a little bit differently, because often we have very specific management goals for them, especially if we start talking landscape rehydration. So you can see you can break up your landscape into different parts of the puzzle, if you like. And the key challenge with rebooting landscapes is designing the puzzle, if you like, or arranging the parts to your landscape in a really coherent way that is a win-win for you and your agricultural business and a win for the environment. And that's the real art and science of landscape planning or property planning in the 21st century. So because they're rural landscapes, our farm landscapes, they have a third dimension to them. So we looked at geography and the landscape elements, and the third dimension or puzzles on the jigsaw, if you like, are the agricultural elements. So that's the fences, the roads, the stock points, the sheds, etc. So those things, humans come along and plop them in the landscape, and of course that influences not only your enterprise and how you move around your property, for example, but it also influences nature, not just animals and plants, but the way nature interacts with your enterprise. So here's a southwestern Queensland total grazing pressure fence put up to try and minimize wild dog movement inside and outside the boundary, obviously, and that has had profound effects on a whole lot of other aspects in that landscape. Some good, some not so good, but these are the challenges when we're doing managing landscapes for rural needs. And the fourth really important element, if you like, in your rural landscape, is the people, and you as managers, your staff, the wider community may have expectations on you, like they do for, say, the sugarcane farmers now, where there's this expectation that they'll look after country because they're next to the barrier reef. So there's all this social aspect and the economics too, like how profitable is it, my business with this amount of land, etc., for the enterprise I'm trying to do. So the people are this fourth key component, and obviously if we got rid of all the people, everything would be a lot easier, but that ain't going to happen. So we're going to have to learn how to live, one, with each other, and two, with our planet. So I guess all of those four key components, the geography, the landscape elements, the agricultural elements, and the people, all combine to make what I call a rural landscape system. So here's a wet tropics rural landscape in far north Queensland. You can see sugarcane is a dominant industry, although if you look carefully at the bottom of the picture, you'll see vanilla, and there are in fact other tropical tree crops scattered through the valley. You've got a river or a creek, Whoopin Creek, coming through the system as well, and you've got areas of sort of natural bush. You've got rainforest, hills and mountains in the background in the World Heritage Rainforest, and then you've got a whole mosaic of different land activities or different patches, all being managed differently. You've got a riparian area, so all of those things interact with each other. And then of course there's the sugarcane industry, the tropical fruit industry, the people that live there. Every now and again you get towed up by a Cat 4 or Cat 5 cyclone. This is cyclone country, and of course that just puts a big disturbance through the whole thing. So designing a resilient landscape that can bounce back from cyclones, for example, is a key task for everyone, whether you're managing the World Heritage areas or you're managing a sugarcane field. So I guess the big challenge is, when we're talking a rural landscape and those four components, is how do we reboot it? Now, I use the term reboot, but you could feel free to use the term regenerate, which is obviously a popular term now, restore, or rehydrate, which is obviously a very specific aspect of restoring rural landscapes to do with the water cycle. So it is a kind of subtopic here, which I'll touch on tonight, and it is important, but I think it's really important not to forget things like revegetation, or even just improving the agricultural patches so that they're much more stable and resilient, like pastures and cropping systems, etc. So I guess they all come together, and so we might either use reboot or regenerate the whole landscape. And this is a little plot of trees planted a decade or so ago now, northeast Victoria, on a property, and it was probably planted there for a reason, but now it needs some active management because the trees have all sort of stopped growing out and up, and they've all kind of got a bit of canopy lockup. So now we have to sort of see how we can make use of this patch, which is surrounded by grazing patches. Can we get a bit of a win-win out of it? Because sometimes at the moment it's seen as a bit of a kangaroo camp and a bit of a problem for the neighbours. So these are the questions we've got to try and fix and overcome to get a win-win. So I guess the first really important strategy for rebooting your landscape or restoring rural landscapes is changing our thinking. And I call this change in thinking landscape thinking. You might call it ecological thinking or holistic thinking, but it's based on thinking, seeing your landscape, seeing your farm enterprises as part of a landscape, and then using what I call ecologically based thinking to make more holistic decisions that are good for the short-term enterprise, but they're also good for the long term. So that's what I call landscape thinking. And I'll just quote Bruce Milne, who was a pot of farmland plan farmer from 1990. If anyone hasn't heard of the pot of farm plan program, it was a really innovative farm planning framework and project from early 1990, just when landcare was starting to take off as well in Victoria, Western Victoria, this particular project. But it has a really important farm planning framework which can really inform good modern farm planning. There's a few other things you can add to it, but Bruce said you can get your nose right down to the grindstone of looking after sheep and cattle, and don't give yourself time to stand back and take a wide perspective and realize that if you are going to care best for your sheep and cattle, you've got to care for your soil and your land. And when you look at the Potter Farm Plan and the experience of the farmers that went through it, it was about taking a more ecological perspective or a wider perspective to their farm landscape, and then rearranging their farm, their property physically, going through a whole farm planning and creating patches and rearranging the agricultural elements to get a win-win balance and building a resilient business, if you like, as well as a resilient landscape. And so having a wide perspective or a systems thinking is and thinking at different scale, not just your nose to the grindstone scale, but working at that broader scale, are two key aspects of landscape thinking. They're not the only things, but they are important. And here are some guys just mucking around with a jigsaw puzzle, which helps us in Soil and Food just explain some key concepts about landscapes and the parts to them, and how to, the process of thinking about how to go through good, effective planning. So which leads me to the second really important strategy after sort of taking a different approach to your thinking and your perspective on managing your landscape, if we want to reboot things. And the second one is to do design and planning. Now, I know planning can be a really boring word, and when people go, oh yeah, I'm doing some planning, everyone's eyes glaze over like they're about to read Hansard, or they've got to go to the accountant because it's tax time. But actually, design and planning is probably, after changing your thinking, the most important thing you can do if you're trying to transition to regenerative agriculture or reboot or restore your landscape. The design and planning is the key step. And here's some guys just in one of our courses just putting together a mock farm and going through this process of design and planning. So it's a creative process, but it's also a management steps to success, and it's kind of got a little bit of both in it, but it is a key thing. Now in Australia, over the many decades since before the Second World War really, but particularly from around the time of the Second World War, we've had some really important design approaches or planning approaches to rural landscapes, and I'm just listing the main ones there, and I apologize if I've forgotten any, but you've got Yeoman's keyline planning, which some of you may have heard of, which was a really important approach that P.A. Yeomans developed in the 1940s. You've got the land capability framework developed a lot by the soil conservation services across Australia. You've got the whole farm planning approach that the Departments of Agriculture and Soil Con sort of developed, based a lot on land capability, but also including some of Yeoman's ideas as well. Then I've already mentioned the Potter Farm Plan, which kind of pulled a lot of that stuff together and started to use the word ecosystem. So it was kind of like that next step towards ecological thinking. You've got obviously the permaculture approach with zones and sectors, and that was strongly informed by Yeoman's hierarchy of permanence ideas. So permaculture owes a lot to Yeoman's keyline planning and the permaculture planning process. And then you've got natural sequence farming, Peter Andrews' approach, which some of you have probably heard of. And finally, I put in there the Regenerative, which Darren Doherty sort of developed, again, coming out of permaculture and Yeoman's approach, and he's got his Regenerative framework too. So you've got these really important sort of ways to do design and planning that have informed, farmers and graziers and permaculture small blockers to design, get this win-win in their design, if you like. In Soil and Food, we've developed, I guess, building on those previous ones, we bring in this key idea of landscape ecology and use some really important concepts from landscape ecology, which we think can inform a modern 21st century view on planning. So we build on those other ones, and we call our framework rural landscape logic. So, and here's some guys here going through one of the steps of identifying and prioritising issues on their properties near Canberra in this case. So I guess we've looked at three of the key aspects or key strategies to help restoring or regenerating your farm landscape. The first one being changing your thinking, applying some ecological thinking to the situation. The second one being to apply design and planning strategies, take a good design and planning process your property through it. And the third sort of group of things to do that you can do, strategies if you like, is what I call farmscaping. So farmscaping is where you physically change the landscape. Literally, you change it physically. So that often means changing the patches. So you might plant a whole clump of trees and all of a sudden you have a new patch, or you may subdivide paddocks up and all of a sudden you have new little paddocks which are all different patches, or you might build dams, etc., etc. So farmscaping is where you physically modify your landscape. And of course, here's a property, Bibberinga, near Albury, where Jill Sandbrook's been doing some amazing things over a few years. And you can see that she's modified that landscape quite significantly by creating a lot of revegetated patches, in this case on drainage lines and creek lines. But farmscaping is this physically changing your landscape. It can also mean obviously adding fences, etc. as well. Fences, buildings, they're all physical changes to a landscape. So it does include things like rehydration contours, like this one here, Stuart Andrews is building, and natural sequence farming have quite a strong focus on putting these rehydration contours into landscapes, and that's a physical change to not just the hydrology of the landscape, but the physical surface of the ground as well. So another one here, a case study for you from near Albury on the Tay Farm, the ecological farm near Albury, where you can see that is in fact a diversion contour. So it's actually moving water. So it's not like kind of a rehydration contour. It has a bit of a fall to it, but the drain has been put in above the track, and then obviously the access lane's been fenced. So you've got a few different elements there. You've got an access track's been built, you've got fencing, and you've got this drain that's been built, and that water actually goes to a very specific area, what we call a leaky weir system, where it's going through a red gum little patch where we're growing firewood, and those trees are being watered from this runoff. So you can just see all of these elements have been pulled together over time through a whole farm planning process. And another key dimension to farmscaping is, of course, doing what's called grade control or in-stream structures, like this leaky weir, if you like, on one of the Malone Institute's projects, and where you can see they're trying to lift the level of the channel and create a pond and just change the hydrology. So to do that, they had to do some physical changes to the stream system. So whether that's with soft or vegetation infrastructure or hard things like rocks to do that. But you can see that's another type of farmscaping, if you like, physically changing the nature of the landscape, creating new patches. The fourth sort of set of strategies we can use that are in our toolbox, if you like, our land restoration toolbox, is basically applying management. So that's doing things, not necessarily physically changing things, but actually doing things that are quite temporary. So they might be just one-off, or they might be regular events like grazing management. The technical term that we'd use for that is disturbance. So applying disturbance, and that can be grazing, it can be It can even be clearing, like in this case here, where we've got selective thinning of thickening forest patches, just to get a woodland balance back. And you can see some of the tree in the foreground, which has got a broader crown, is obviously growing up in a bit of a woodland open environment. And at the back, we have some young trees that are growing up in quite a dense stand of closed forest. So by thinning out, we can create a more woodland place, but that's a one-off activity that will go on as that thinning. So these disturbances or applied management, that we sometimes call them regenerative management practices, and they can include things like regenerative or ecologically based grazing. I know there's hundreds of words for that. I'll let you just put whichever label you want on it. But this is the guys in North Queensland who are obviously changing their grazing like many other places in Australia, and that's having a significantly positive effect on water infiltration, ground cover, loss of a reduction in the loss of sediment from the landscape. And here's Chris Paul from North Queensland Dry Tropics just demonstrating, showing off the ground cover and the soil surface condition in a healthy paddock. So we've got things like grazing management and other things like multi-species cover cropping, pasture cropping, no-kill cropping. There's multi-species pastures. There's a whole lot of tactics we can use to help improve particularly agricultural plots, but even in biodiversity areas, you might do things like selective thinning or using fire strategically. I know some people don't like burning at all, but fire is a tool in the toolbox. So, you're using these tools to manipulate the landscape and try to move it towards a more healthy state. But of course, you've got to have a goal for what you're trying to achieve. So that sort of toolbox full of regenerative management practices is the fourth sort of main set of strategies that we have in our overall farm landscape restoration toolbox. So I guess we've had a look at what is a farm landscape. It's kind of got these four parts to the puzzle: geography, landscape elements, which are mainly patches and hydrological units. It's got agriculture, obviously, fences and roads and all the rest of it. And then it's got people. And there's four main sort of groups of strategies we can use to reboot that landscape. So I guess that there's lots of tools in the toolbox. So how do I make a start on my place? Well, I guess it's good to kind of follow a process, like tools and I guess it's like anything, whether you're going on holiday or you're trying to build a house, it's a really good idea to have a logical process. There's no point putting the carpet down in the house when the roof isn't on yet, for example, and there's no point booking the Thai seafood restaurant if you haven't got your passport and your COVID vaccination passport sorted. You ain't going to get to that Thai restaurant until you pay for the ticket and get your passport finished. So it's good to have a logical process, and it's the same for regenerating landscapes, designing them, planning them, implementing some of these strategies that are appropriate to you. It's good to follow some steps in a logical way, and so we just call these steps to success. So the first key step is to make sense of your farm landscape. Understand those four components of geography, the landscape elements, the agricultural elements, and the people. In this case, these guys are looking at soil types and soil landscapes, which of course is one of those geographical elements that influences vegetation, animal behavior, how you manage paddocks, all the rest of it, and how water moves. All of that's influenced by soil type and rocks, of course, geology. So that first really important thing is make sense of your rural landscape. Learn about that rural landscape system. Learn how to see it as with a landscape ecological lens, if you like, more holistically than maybe what we've been doing. And that's not to throw out things like paddocks and land classes and things. We're just trying to actually add another dimension to those things, a little bit more of a 21st century view of seeing them as a landscape and using some ecological theory, because remembering we need a landscape to grow environmental products and a landscape to grow agricultural products. So we can apply some applied modern ecology to our thinking. The second really important thing is having a clear vision and goals of where you're headed. Like a lot of people think, oh, we've got to maybe take this landscape back to where it was pre-European settlement. But basically, we live in the Anthropocene. We're doing agriculture on a lot of areas of Australia. So I guess really what we're trying to do is create new landscapes that then they're never going to be the same as they were pre-European colonisation of Australia. The Aboriginal First Peoples managed landscapes for different needs and differently than what our immediate white ancestors have done for the last couple of 100 years. And I guess we've now got the challenge of trying to restore some of these landscapes, improve them. So it's about creating new landscapes, and we're not trying to create national parks. We're trying to create landscapes that are actually going to grow food and fibre as well as look after biodiversity. So these are the challenges we have, is setting this new vision and these goals. So once you've got a sort of understanding of your rural landscape, and then you've got some sort of broad directions for it, then it's a matter of assessing it. So in this case, the guys are assessing the soil health with the HASH, or Holistic Assessment of Soil Health Framework, but it's about assessing how the soil is functioning. How's the water cycle going? Is the water cycle optimum? What's the biodiversity like? What's the efficiency of the enterprise? Do I have to spend a lot of time getting animals from this part of the property to that because the crossings are no good, or they have to go right around here? What's the layout from the you have to assess the whole system. Do we have enough shelter on this farm? Do we have enough corridors? Because one of our goals might be biodiversity connectivity, or it might just be shelter for stock. Do I want some fence posts in 20 years, so I want some more trees. What are your goals? And then you're assessing this current situation and scoring it and objectively assessing it. Once you've assessed it, you can identify issues like these guys here are doing just with colourful dots. You can identify issues, and some of the issues are blue, as you can see. They're water issues. Other ones might be green. They might be vegetation issues or biodiversity issues, and red might be an enterprise issue. But you can identify those issues once you've assessed your landscape and start to prioritise them. Which are the important ones? Which are the ones that if I fix them, that'll help other ones, so I don't have to spend all the money? So that prioritisation process is quite tricky, and it takes time, design and brainstorming. And thinking takes thinking time. So you need to put some time and effort into it. And then once you've identified those high priority issues, it's about setting specific targeted outcomes, like on this property here, where the road, and particularly you can't quite see it, but on the left of that gully washout is a fence, and then there's a revegetation area. And they probably didn't sort of line it up that well when they put in that revegetate. They got funding to do it back in the day as usual, and then no one's been able to come out and monitor it and look after it for a few years. But the road could have been put in a bit differently, or built a bit differently, or maybe the fence line could have been just shifted just a little bit to just minimize that runoff, because it's quite a steep up and down slope here, and they've had problems with that road ever since. So it's just thinking that, okay, what's my outcome here for the long term, so that the access to that part of the property, which this is a key access track to a large part of the property, can be improved for the long term. So once I've got sort of my clear identified priorities, and I've my issues, and I've got some outcomes that I want, then it's about brainstorming solutions. Like if one of the challenges is dieback in trees, like on the New England of New South Wales here, and that's my friend Dave Carr, an ecologist, works in biodiversity with farmers. And you can see here we're all talking about, okay, how do we keep some biodiversity patches in grazing landscapes and get a win-win? And what specifically does that mean? Well, one of the things it means is leaving some timber on the ground. Obviously, if one of your goals is biodiversity outcomes, maybe I need to fence off some areas, maybe not. So it's brainstorming all of those things so you can come up with the right mix of solutions for your place. Here's a Mulloon Institute plan for a small floodplain, concise stream, and they're just sort of trying to identify the right place to do some interventions. But you can see you're analysing the landscape, identifying your problem areas, and then saying, all right, well, here's one option. We can fix the hydrology in this situation here. So once you've brainstormed all your solutions and you come up with the right mix for your place, you basically can develop your own property plan, which has a mix of strategies and tactics that are applicable to your landscape and your business goals and your landscape goals. So, every property, every landscape, every farm business is unique. And so you've really got to go through that process. But after going through that process, you can develop your own property plan for a rebooted landscape. And so now, obviously, unless you're a quadrillionaire like Gina or Twiggy or whatever, and you've got serious coin, it's going to take you time to get to that end goal. It might take all of your life or the rest of your life, but at least you've got that long-term plan, because that's the key thing about ecological thinking. You think at longer term scales than just, oh, yep, I need it done for this month or this year. So obviously there's going to be some short-term, next 2 years, what I'm going to do, but you've got that longer-term plan that aligns to your vision of how you're going to restore and a rebooted landscape that is functioning differently than it is now, contributing to the environment, building resilience regionally as well as for you, as well as being productive. If agriculture is a key focus, if it's your business, then obviously it has to be a resilient agricultural business as well. And so from that, you can develop an action plan for the next couple of years, to give you specific things to do. So, all right, I'm going to fix this road here first, and then we're going to subdivide those paddocks over there because we've already got some timber over there. So we're going to rearrange that before we jump into this other area down here. So you can develop a short-term action plan for the next couple of years. And then, of course, once you've done all that, you have to get in and get started on it. So here's Cam Wilson, who used to work at the Malone Institute. And Cam's just showing a group of landholders there how to stabilise some gully erosion in the upper catchment of a site near Goulburn, just using some simple local materials. So, it's just getting in and get started and starting to tick off your to-do list, whether it's small jobs like this, not that was that small, it took us all day, it was a bit of hard yakka, or a bigger job, obviously, like planting 5,000 trees or protecting a riparian area, or putting in watering points for stock, so I'm changing my grazing, whatever it is, get started on your high priority actions. So I think I've sort of covered off those key processes of rebooting your landscape. This is the official end of the presentation. I've probably gone through it faster than what I thought I would. But yeah, so you can see that this is just a group, a Mudama Landcare group. Again, just talking about some solutions for that little gully that's a bit of a problem for the landholder, and trying to come up with a win-win situation. And in this case, the win-win situation is, can we use it as a sheep camp for lambing in a cool, difficult, cooler snap cold, because the lamandra and the tall grasses can actually act as a little bit of shelter for lambs at foot. And so, you could stabilize that gully by resting it for a lot of the year, but then actually use it strategically so that it becomes actually a really valuable little patch. At the moment, it's a problem patch, but it could be a really valuable patch for that sheep enterprise, as well as improving the hydrology, the biodiversity through that farm landscape. So I guess I'll kind of pull it up at that point and say, I think it is a really big challenge to regenerate or restore or rehydrate / all of those things, rebooting our farm landscapes. And I guess one of the really important parts to it is going through a really good design and planning process. But then there's a whole suite of strategies, from regenerative agricultural practices, revegetation, which I'm sure many of you are already familiar with, and some of the newer tactics around landscape rehydration that can be used as tools to help you kind of transition your property to a better place. So on that note, I'll probably pull it together, Kate, and say thanks everyone for coming in and listening, and open it up for a few questions.
Thanks, David. Really fantastically insightful. I'm just curious, now there's so much talk about carbon farming, and obviously a lot of what you do. Is there when you're doing your farm planning, are you sort of bringing that in at all in any way?
Yeah, I think, Kate, well, this is the opportunity. I think, as I mentioned, that environmental products are, in many ways, they're very similar to agricultural products. Carbon and biodiversity, you need your landscape to grow them. So yeah, it's exactly that. So you can, just like you're planning your agricultural enterprise as you go through that, planning and design process, this is the opportunity we have now is, okay, can I include in my farm business these environmental products? And by doing a really good, well thought through planning and design process, I can really get to the tin tacks of that, of yep, okay, the carbon project would align and be a win-win, or a biodiversity project to get biodiversity credit. So yeah, it's an ideal opportunity. And I guess it's this newer way of thinking of your place as a landscape, and there could be multiple enterprises going on if it's really well thought through. So definitely something we touch on, and you know, if the opportunities are there, then let's include it in that setting the goals and then in the design process.
And I believe, I don't know much about it yet, but I believe the government is actually talking now about offering or allowing farmers to have integrated carbon projects. So rather than just one
Yep.
thing, you can pull in all the different aspects, and it goes towards the project. So
yes, it's definitely the next version of the methodology will have that as well. So that'll be an opportunity for more than just only soil carbon or only plant, you know, vegetation carbon or only fire, savanna burning carbon. You know, you'll be able to, and again, having that whole farm plan ecologically done is critical for that. Yeah.
So I have a question here. Can you give some examples of short-term goals versus ones that might take a bit longer to implement?
Oh, sure. So I guess for example, if you're an area and one of your goals is to get more scattered trees across a couple of paddocks, a bit like a woodland type pattern, you might not have any trees, then obviously it might take you a little bit of time. So revegetation, you know, you might have a longer goal of, you know, this many trees in this arrangement, because it's not just how many trees, or if you're talking about revegetation or trees and shrubs, but it's also about how they're arranged. So obviously a long-term goal might be, you know, I want 20% of the property to have trees and shrubs, you know, strategically planted for landscape function. But the short-term goal might be, righto, I'm going to get these two paddocks here, or this fence line along here, or whatever, or this clump planted here. So I guess the short-term goals are the specific things for the next couple of years, where the longer-term broad sort of outcomes of those bigger picture things. And I think it's good to have both, and then obviously you're adapting them as you go too. You know, in 5 years you might revisit it, or 3 years, and go, all right, we'll tweak them a little bit. But that might be one example. Another one might be, you might have a severe erosion or hydrology issue, like erosion or some kind of water problem, and you want to do a short-term fix on a particular gully, but the longer-term goal might be to restore ground cover in an upper catchment area and manage grazing on another upper catchment area, which could be steep, hard country to access, and that might take a few years before you get on top of that, which would minimise the erosion potential of that gully. But in the short term, you might want to kind of just put something in because it's causing a problem at a very local site. So yeah, I guess there's two steps in that. There's the short-term stuff and then the longer-term stuff. So we kind of flip between both. And
I guess like any planning mechanism, you've got to have a feedback loop, don't you, to revisit? So how do you recommend farmers do that?
Yeah, well, that's just spending some time every couple of years, seeing where you're headed and what you've done, and then going, all right, are we still headed this way, or what's come up that's different that we have to adapt for? Maybe a carbon opportunity comes up in 2 or 3 years' time, and therefore, okay, well, we have to modify our plan and design that in for it. So that obviously then there's a revision on the whole farm plan. So it is a living document. So if you use it in that way, then yeah, there's that ongoing, every couple of years you're really checking in on it and adapting it as you need to.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of people transitioning from, you know, what sort of things they're doing now to perhaps more ecologically aware type of approaches can be a challenge profitably, I suppose, for some. You know, how, let's say someone was aiming to lower their farm inputs, they wanted to move away from synthetic inputs over time. How long would it take them, do you think, to make that transition?
Oh, it depends a bit, Kate, on what their business structure or their enterprise is now, like how reliant they are on inputs and what their business model in terms of production is. You know, like obviously you need a certain amount of income for the family business to survive. So you've got to then look at, okay, this is my income needs, my break even, but more than that, obviously I need the living wage or the living income for the family and our needs. So then you're going, all right, if I lower the inputs, I lower my cost base too. So really you've got to go through what we call transition planning for rebooting the farm enterprises, and the whole farm planning process, the planning your farm, is part of that. But then there's obviously looking at the specifics of the enterprise. So, for example, dairy farmers that go from a very high urea using high intense ryegrass every year or every second year renovation on the paddock to a no urea, no grain dairy system, it can take a couple of years to transition. And I've seen dairy farmers I've worked with, go through that in 2 or 3 years and come out the other end very successfully. But you do have to do that business planning as well as the enterprise, working out the enterprise plan, and then try maybe transitioning one part of the property, stepping through it. Yeah, so it can take a couple of years. And again, having that business plan running in parallel with the property plan, the farm enterprise plan, is really important.
Yeah, okay. So would that come up as part of your farm planning when you're doing
I think in the farm planning, the courses we're planning to do next year, we'll certainly touch on that. But I guess it's more the 4-day course is more about really looking at the overall layout, if you like, of the property, which really aligns to your enterprises. So, for example, if you're grazing and you want to lower your inputs and be more pasture based with not so many fertilizers or soil amendments, then it's about obviously how many subdivisions I need for my mobs, and so that I can improve soil health as well as manage my dry matter production for the animals, and then also getting diversity in there so that the animals have a more diverse diet, which definitely improves the efficiency or the productivity of the animals. So you've got those 3 things. So I guess there's the whole of property thinking, but then you'll have within that, okay, these pastures over here, how do I improve them? And part of that will be grazing management on and off, and part of it might be sowing some more diversity into it, or improving soil health. There'll be a whole combination of sort of enterprise tactics to think through as well.
Yeah. Well, it looks like we've got to the end of our questions, but I thought it was fantastic. I think it's a great way of thinking about how to go about things, and the logical process. It seems so logical. It's funny, isn't it, how logical isn't always obvious, but when you think about it, it makes much sense. So thank you very much, David, for a very informative presentation. For our audience, David is actually going to be travelling to WA in February to deliver a series of Plan Your Farm landscape workshops for us, in which participants will develop a holistic farm plan. So we had actually planned to run the event this year, but due to COVID, we weren't able to. There are still a few tickets left, so head to our website if you're interested in booking for that program. So once again, David, thank you very much. I know it's late where you are. You're 3 hours.
Oh, it's not too bad. No, thanks, Kate, for having us. No, thanks for having us, and hopefully everyone got a bit of food for thought from that. And I look forward to catching up with you guys when I come over in February, COVID dependent.
Yeah, well, all the best from here in the West, from us here in the West. For everyone else, that's it for today. Before you sign out, can I ask you to complete our survey? I know it's a bit of a pain to do, but really important for us to get your feedback, and make sure that we're providing content that's important to you. So thanks once again, everybody, and look forward to seeing you at our next event, which actually is about regenerative grazing with Dick Richardson. He's coming over from South Australia to do Grazing Naturally Part 2, which is on Thursday the 10th of December. So if you're interested in coming to that event, again, head to our website. We've got tickets left for that as well. All right. Thanks very much, everybody, and good night.